Ukrainian President Zelensky is due to speak to world leaders to mark the third anniversary of the Russian invasion. Sir Keir Starmer has joined a morning call, a show of solidarity as relations with the US remain fragile. He's reiterated that Kyiv must be at the heart of any peace talks. Security Minister Dan Jarvis has told LBC News he believes there can be productive conversations with Donald Trump.
What would constitute a successful trip is a further cementing of the special relationship that we do enjoy with the United States. Clearly, we have shared interests with regard to the economy, with regard to security. The United States, the United Kingdom are key partner members of NATO. And success looks like productive and constructive conversations with their new president to ensure that we're continuing to work as closely as we possibly can. Clearly, Ukraine forms the backdrop for the conversations that will be taking place. It's incredibly important that the United States wield their huge influence in order to bring that conflict to a conclusion. And I'm confident that the Prime Minister will have productive conversations with the President.
Well, right now, the French President Emmanuel Macron has been to the White House. He's holding talks with Donald Trump. Mr. Trump's been accused of turning out European leaderships as he looks to end Russia's war in Ukraine quickly. Well, let's head to Washington, D.C. and speak to our correspondent, Simon Marks, and, well, set the scene for this meeting.
Well, Jim, let's see how that prognosis from Dan Jarvis works out over the course of the next 96 hours or so. I mean, the notion that anyone is still talking about the deepening of the special relationship between the US and the UK rather flies in the face of what the man who's likely to become Germany's next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has been saying, arguing that Europe now needs to prepare itself for the worst-case scenario, for a United States that is no longer an ally of Europe, but actually an adversary because it is aligning itself firmly behind Vladimir Putin. We will get a sense of where all this is going over the course of the next few hours because Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is here today. He's kind of the precursor to Sir Keir Starmer's visit to Washington, D.C. on Thursday. He and President Trump have already met in the Oval Office this morning. They participated in a G7 leaders summit call. And the big question hanging over that, of course, was America's refusal over the weekend to allow the G7 in a statement to refer to Russian aggression having started the war in Ukraine 3 years ago. And what a difference an election makes generally. I mean, by this time last year and the year before, on the 24th of February, we were already here in Washington, D.C., knee-deep in statements from the Biden administration excoriating the Russians. Fresh announcements of military assistance for Ukraine were being made. New sanctions were unveiled against Russia on the anniversary of its war beginning on Ukraine. So far from the White House, absolute crickets today. Let's see if they've managed to come up with any kind of language that in any meaningful way points the finger of blame for this conflict by the G7 at Moscow, or whether Donald Trump is truly, as certainly he appeared to be doing last week, digging in his heels and delivering Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin pretty much everything that Vladimir Putin wants, gaming the outcome of any peace talks that take place in Ukraine, insisting that no, Kyiv will not be offered NATO membership, that no, there will be no continuing of American assistance to Ukraine, except, of course, provided Ukraine agrees to give up much of its mineral wealth, those rare earths like lithium that lie beneath Ukraine's soil. Donald Trump covets those and engaged in some strong-arm sort of mafia-style tactics 10 or 11 days ago to try and force Volodymyr Zelensky to sign away the country's rights to that mineral wealth. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who went to Kyiv brandishing a piece of paper and urging Volodymyr Zelensky to sign it, the Ukrainian leader told him he could stuff it, has taken to the pages of the Financial Times today to emphasize why he thinks this kind of an arrangement is in Ukraine's interests, because he says the United States will then engage in the governance and oversight of reconstruction efforts in Ukraine, which he argues will guarantee that those efforts are transparent, accountable and free from corruption. This is the Treasury Secretary for the same US US government, whose new Attorney General Pam Bondi, on her first day in office, gutted efforts by the Department of Justice to enforce anti-corruption laws that are on America's books. So to see the Treasury Secretary in the FT today suggesting that America is sort of the guarantor of probity when it comes to something like the reconstruction of Ukraine because of the anti-corruption practices that it is engaged in the past is, of course, no guarantee of what might happen in the future because America itself, under Donald Trump's leadership, is no longer enforcing many of those anti-corruption laws. So what Emmanuel Macron achieves over the course of the next few hours, I think, is very unclear. I mean, clearly he's got to try, as the Prime Minister will have to try, to bring Donald Trump back down to earth and to say whatever your frustrations with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who clearly stuck in Donald Trump's craw last week by saying entirely correctly that Donald Trump is swimming in a bubble of disinformation. Whatever your problems with Zelensky, you know, there has to be a return to the principle that has been rooted in Washington's approach to this conflict from day one, which is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. No decisions made about Ukraine's future without consultation with President Zelensky or whoever succeeds him, because remember, Zelensky said over the weekend he'd be willing to give up his position if that guaranteed Ukraine's ability to join NATO. Absolutely clear that the Trump administration is going to rule that out completely. We will be hearing, we think, from both Donald Trump and President Macron at around 7 o'clock tonight, UK time. They have a joint press conference scheduled at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. How that goes, I think, will be the best indicator that we will get of what kind of talks are taking place behind the scenes at the White House. Those bilateral talks haven't started yet. They'll be getting underway at around 5:15 UK time. So there's a gap now between the G7 leaders' call and the direct talks between Macron and Trump. And, of course, Emmanuel Macron absolutely trying to soften the ground up and pave the way for Sir Keir Starmer to be here on Thursday. The UK Prime Minister has definitely piqued Washington's interest with his suggestion that he might be willing to commit US forces to a peacekeeping operation in Ukraine, but only if the United States provides a backstop. Last week, the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz indicated that that was of interest to the Trump administration, but it's only Monday, Jim. Thursday feels like it's a long way away.
It certainly is, and I know that some of it will be listening in and watching the press conference with Macron and Trump will be Prime Minister Starmer. I mean, he has been openly backing and supporting, with ironclad support, Ukraine. But in the language he used, saying that the US President Donald Trump's changed the global conversation around Ukraine for the better. He's brought about these talks that could bring lasting peace in Ukraine, which is what we all want to see. His tone, he's got to get it right.
Yes, he has. I mean, he's got to absolutely flatter the President of the United States. And we have seen all the people around Donald Trump flattering him constantly over the last few days. If you watched the press briefing that the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz held after their talks in Riyadh with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and other officials from Russia, every 20 seconds, one of them was saying, and of course this would never have happened without Donald Trump. Only Donald Trump can possibly bring about an end to the war in Ukraine. In the readout of the conversation that took place this weekend between Donald Trump and the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, or as Trump refers to him, Governor Trudeau, because he's still encouraging Canada to become America's 51st state, we were assured by the White House that Prime Minister Trudeau had told Donald Trump that only he had the capacity to bring about peace in Ukraine. So it's vital, I think, for any visiting foreign leader, including the Prime Minister, to stipulate to the notion that Donald Trump has such unique capacities and abilities that he is the only man alive that can possibly bring this conflict to a close. To be fair, There are questions, of course, for Joe Biden about why he, as president, did nothing to advance any kind of peace process. I mean, he was funneling billions of dollars of American assistance to Ukraine, certainly not the $500 billion that Donald Trump sometimes claims, certainly not the $350 billion that Donald Trump sometimes claims, closer to about $100 billion, but a substantial amount of money nonetheless. Now, the Americans want that money back, and they want to get their hands on that money by basically robbing Ukraine of its rare earth minerals. What Macron and the Prime Minister might suggest is that the European Union has got its hands on $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets. You could use some of that money to pay the Americans back. Of course, Vladimir Putin wouldn't be very happy about that. So we'll have to see whether Donald Trump, by association, channeling his inner Vladimir Putin, similarly is unhappy about the idea of using Russian money, given that Russia is, whatever the Trump administration says, the aggressor in Ukraine, using that cash to pay the United States back for some of its largesse offered to Kiev over the last 3 years, might certainly be an idea that the European Union wants to keep plugging away at, and Keir Starmer might try to advance it. I suspect it'll get short shrift in the White House, but let's see whether over the next 3 or 4 days this Trump administration is willing to give anything away about in terms of the positions that they have staked out so far. It was notable this morning that the new Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, was back on his old morning TV show on Fox News and was asked whether he could could he simply articulate an agreement with the sentence that Russia was the aggressor in the war on Ukraine. It was Russia what started it. And the only thing that the Defense Secretary of the United States was prepared to say is that he was willing to stipulate to the fact that this was a very complex situation. That is how far things have gone in just the last, 5 weeks, is it? Since the inauguration? I've now lost track. We're into the 5th week of Donald Trump's exhausting presidency, and that is how far things have moved.
US correspondent live in Washington, Simon Marks, thank you.